They're tearing it down right now. My phone speaker was shaking with my neighbor's voice when I answered the call in my hotel room. For God's sake, Daniel, they've got machines out here. Karen says the HOA ordered it. I sat up straight in the chair. What tower? There was a loud metal crash on the other end of the call. My water tower, the one behind your land. My stomach tightened. That tower sits on my property, I said slowly. My neighbor lowered his voice. Karen says you abandoned it, and the HOA is removing it for safety. I stood up immediately. That tower supplies water to 3 farms, I replied. It's private property. Another loud bang echoed through the phone. They just knocked the ladder off, he said. Karen is standing here smiling like she owns the place. I walked to the hotel window trying to stay calm. Put the phone on video, I told him. A few seconds later, the screen lit up. Dust filled the air. A yellow bulldozer was pushing against the base of the steel water tower, the same tower my father built 30 years ago, and right in front of it stood Karen, white sunglasses, arms crossed, talking to a man with a clipboard like she was running a construction site. My neighbor whispered. She told everyone the HOA voted to remove unsafe structures. I stared at the screen. That tower isn't unsafe, I said. The man driving the bulldozer pushed again. The metal frame groaned loudly. Karen clapped once like she was celebrating something. Then she said something loud enough for the phone to catch it. Finally, that ugly thing is gone. I felt my jaw tighten. Because Karen wasn't just destroying a tower. She was destroying the main water source feeding the entire lower side of the valley. 3 farms, dozens of cattle, and a small orchard that belonged to a retired couple. My neighbor asked quietly, "What do we do?" I watched the bulldozer slam into the tower again. A bolt snapped loose. Karen laughed. Then she said the one sentence that made the entire situation very clear. Once this is gone, the HOA can force everyone to connect to the new water contract. That's when I understood. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. I grabbed my laptop and opened my contacts. Listen carefully, I told my neighbor. Let them finish. He sounded shocked. You're letting them destroy it? I closed the laptop slowly. Yes. Then I said something that made him pause. Because the moment that tower falls, Karen is going to owe me a brand new one. The next morning, my phone rang again before sunrise. Daniel, it's down, my neighbor said quietly. I opened the photo he sent. The water tower was lying in twisted metal across the field. Pipes broken. The tank crushed. Karen was standing next to it with the same smug smile, talking to a group of neighbors like she had just cleaned up the town. She's telling everyone the HOA saved the community from a dangerous structure, my neighbor whispered. I zoomed in on the photo. Behind Karen, a brand new sign had already been planted in the ground. Future site of Valley Water Service. HOA approved. I leaned back in my chair. So that's the plan, I said. What plan? My neighbor asked. She destroys the tower, then forces everyone to buy water from her company. There was silence on the phone. Then he said something that made the situation worse. Daniel, she's already sending people bills. $5,000 per property to connect. I closed my eyes for a moment. Farmers couldn't pay that overnight. Some of them had owned their land for generations. Karen knew that, which meant she wasn't just greedy. She was counting on people being scared. My neighbor spoke again. People are angry, but they think the HOA has the authority. I opened another email on my laptop. Let them believe that for a few more hours, I said calmly. Why? He asked. I smiled slightly. Because the repair crew just landed at the airport. He sounded confused. Repair crew, Daniel? The tower is completely destroyed. I looked again at the photo of the crushed steel. I know, I replied. Then I sent one last message from my phone. Heavy equipment, engineers, survey team, all confirmed. My neighbor hesitated. Daniel, what are you planning? I stood up and grabbed my coat. Tell Karen something for me. What? Tell her the owner of that tower is coming home today. He laughed nervously. She's not going to like that. I walked toward the airport gate and said quietly, No, she's really not going to like what arrives with me. By the time I reached the valley that evening, half the neighborhood was already gathered near the broken tower. The metal frame was still lying across the field like a fallen giant. Karen stood beside a table handing out papers. Sign here if you want water back by next week, she kept saying, tapping the forms like she owned the land. Farmers looked tired and worried. Some were already pulling out their checkbooks. Then the sound of engines rolled down the dirt road behind them. Everyone turned. 3 heavy trucks, 2 survey vehicles, and a large crane slowly pulled into the field. Karen frowned. "What is this?" I stepped out of the first truck and shut the door. "Good timing," I said calmly. "You just destroyed my tower." Karen laughed loudly so the crowd could hear. "Your tower? That dangerous thing was a public hazard. The HOA approved removal." I walked past her and handed a folder to the county inspector, who had just stepped out of the second truck. He flipped through the papers for a moment, then looked straight at Karen. "Ma'am, this structure is registered as a private agricultural water facility. Destroying it without the owner's consent is property damage." Karen's smile stiffened. The HOA voted. The inspector slowly pointed to the documents. "There is no active HOA here." The crowd started murmuring. Karen raised her voice. "Fine. Then he can rebuild it himself?" I nodded and looked back at the trucks behind me. The crane engine roared to life. Workers began unloading brand new steel sections from the trailers. Pipes, bolts, a fresh water tank shining in the sunlight. Karen blinked in shock. What is that?" I folded my arms. "The replacement tower." The inspector closed the folder and added calmly, "And since the original one was illegally destroyed, the responsible party will be paying the full reconstruction cost." Karen's face turned pale. "Responsible party?" I pointed to the bulldozer still sitting next to the wreckage. The company logo was printed clearly on the side, the same company Karen had hired yesterday. The inspector looked at her again. "Your signed demolition order makes you legally liable." The crowd went completely silent. One farmer whispered, "How much does a water tower cost?" The crane lifted the massive new tank slowly into the air as the workers began setting the foundation. I looked back at Karen and answered calmly, "About $600,000. Her legs actually stepped backward, but the inspector wasn't finished. He held up another document. "And because the destruction cut water access to 3 farms, there will also be civil damages." Karen stared at the rising tower, then at the crowd that was now looking at her very differently. And right there, while the new tower began rising behind me, she realized something too late. The moment she knocked down my tower, she had built the biggest problem of her own life. Karen stood there frozen while the crane slowly lifted the new tank into place. The entire crowd watched in silence as the steel frame rose piece by piece, higher than the old one ever was. Farmers who had looked worried that morning were now smiling, whispering to each other. Mr. Harris, the old orchard owner, shook his head and laughed. "Boy, you didn't just replace it? You upgraded it." I nodded slightly. "Stronger steel, bigger tank, double the water." Karen's voice finally came back, but it was weak now. You planned this." I looked at her calmly. "No, you planned it the moment you knocked it down." The county inspector finished writing on his clipboard and handed her a paper. "Ma'am, you'll be contacted about damages and fraud. Charges connected to the fake HOA notices." Karen stared at the paper like it was poison. The farmers around us slowly began clapping as the final bolt was tightened on the new tower. Clean water started flowing through the pipes again within the hour. Cattle drank. Sprinklers came back to life in the fields. The retired couple from the orchard walked over and hugged me like I was family. As for Karen, the same bulldozer she hired was loaded onto a trailer and driven away while she stood there alone. No crowd around her anymore. By sunset, the new tower was shining over the valley, taller and stronger than the old one. Mr. Harris leaned on the fence and smiled. "Your father would have been proud of that tower." I looked up at it and said quietly, "He always told me something. Never let someone bully you off your own land." The wind moved across the fields, the water pumps humming again like nothing had ever happened. And that day, the whole valley learned one simple truth. If someone tries to tear down what you built, sometimes the best answer is to rebuild it even bigger.